this is where, in one of our shambolic starts to an interview, Johnny J.R. Rickwood, author of Cougarmania, which I'm holding up here.
There we are.
This is it. The cliche is a labour of love, Johnny. I mean, sometimes I've thought about writing a book, and then I give up quickly. And I've looked through the appendices and references at the back of this, and that's why I don't bother writing a book, because you've put so much effort into this, and I could never get anywhere near that. Why? Why have you written this? Why have you done this?
I think the key word, I was sat in my lounge one morning, and I was working on I've written one fiction book, and I was working on a fiction book, and I got to the point where I just thought, no, it's not working for me. So I thought, right, need to go back to storyboard. And I sat there and I thought, what is an incredible story? And for years, every time I thought of what's an incredible story, it was Cougarmania. Just that story of kind of rags to riches, with all the characters and all the swerves, the twists, the turns, you know, the proverbial goodies and baddies all thrown into the mix, and you've got one hell of a story. And I was a bit like yourself. I thought, oh, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I'll be able to do this, because I'll have to speak to a lot of people. And really that day, I just kind of thought, well, surely somebody's written something. Surely there's already a book about Cougarmania. And there was a book by a guy called Brian Lund, and it was written in the mid-90s. And it's just here, actually. I read it quite often, and Brian's book is really good. But it's years old, and it kind of stopped around 97. So I kind of thought, well, I need to tell this story. So that's why I started.
Starting and then couldn't finish, because this is, as I say, this is a lot of work. I mean, how many words have you got in this? 450 odd pages. This is a hell of a piece of work.
Yeah, 100. I think it ended up around 150 odd thousand, maybe more. Can't remember. 175, something like that.
I struggled getting a dissertation. I had to get my wife to type it up for me at the time. So there's no way I could do anything like this. But you are telling a story of something which, it seems to be another one of those rugby league things that, I guess there could be a book written like this about Toronto. A bright flash that fizzled out, but is potentially coming back in some form or another with the current run of Keithley back in the championship. But what's your connection with the club? Why are you sat here talking about a book about the Keighley Cougars, which, for all intents and purposes, are a second, third division rugby league team?
So I'm a product, really, of Cougarmania. So Cougars came to my school, because I grew up in Oxenhope in West Yorkshire, and they came to my school. I think I was around about 7 or 8. It's in the book, but I can't remember the exact age. And I met Andy Ayres and Joe Grimmer. And I fell in love with the whole concept of Cougarmania, which was obviously geared very heavily towards people in my demographic. And then I left Yorkshire when I was about 18. I went to Wales, and I've stayed here ever since, really. And I kind of lost touch with what was going on. And as you'll know, and as people who listen to the podcast will know, the Cougars have had some really bad troubles over the years. And really, until the O'Neills came back in, I'd not paid much attention to the club. But then I just rediscovered Cougarmania and all of its wonders. And I thought, this story, I've just got to tell it, start to finish.
It's a great period of change across rugby league, of course, in the mid-90s, the evolution of Super League, mergers, rebrands all over the place. But Keithley seem to have got there first with the Cougar name. And I know that obviously other clubs have had names and such in the past, but they really got behind not just having a name attached like Huddersfield Barracudas say, but actually getting behind it with the community work and getting involved with the kids and the future generations of supporters.
Exactly. And I think that's what the key was, is, like you said, there was the Huddersfield Barracudas. They'd been the raft of expansion teams in the 80s that had taken on names such, like the Mansfield Marksmen, etc. And really, everything that had come prior to them, I'm going to put the Sheffield Eagles in one corner, really, aside from the other teams I'm talking about. But all those other clubs, they just provided the name change. They hadn't provided the culture change and the kind of progression that Keighley was showing at the time. And I think that's what made them stand out, is they reformed not only the club top to bottom and the culture, but also the town as well. And they did, if you look at things that Gary Hetherington's Sheffield Eagles were doing as well, there was one article that I read where basically somebody had written to all the clubs and asked them for, they portrayed themselves as a fan moving to the area, and they asked for a fixture list, and they asked for, what merchandise do you sell, and when your home games and directions, etc. And the only rugby league club that could provide them all of those information was the Sheffield Eagles. So I think what Keithley did, in a sense, is they really took that Americanized presentation of sport and the idea of integrating a club into the community, and that is what they progressed.
It's strange because I've mentioned before, one of the things that got me in the mid-90s was ice hockey. And the adverts on the radio for the Sheffield Steelers, and went to plenty of games, still follow them from afar these days. Don't get to as many games as I like to, but that's a cost thing and an everything else thing, as everything else is these days. But they sold the old phrase, they sold the sizzle rather than the steak. So, but once you got there, you found out, actually, this ice hockey is quite entertaining. And it's the same with rugby league in a sense, isn't it? You have to sell people on something more than just a game. And it's not just a problem for Keithley in the late 80s, early 90s. This is a problem that's still going on today, it seems, and it's still a problem we haven't solved.
Exactly. And I think that rugby league is, and I won't get into the kind of historic issues of league that I kind of discovered during the research of the book. But one of the main is rugby league doesn't really know how to sell itself, as you will know. And the thing that Keighley did in the 90s is they looked outside of what the traditional ways of marketing were, which were non-existent, to be honest. And let's not forget that they were a third-tier side as they are now. They were the bottom of the barrel. They'd finished bottom of the whole of the rugby league just a couple of years prior. And what they did is they looked at what was working elsewhere. They took a model, that Americanized model from the States, and they brought that to the UK. And, we're talking about things like, a jazzy shirt with sponsorships, reaching out to communities, having Cougar classrooms. They were doing things like even a failed attempt at launching their own Cougar Vision TV show with matches. They were doing things like that way before, not just, the rugby league sides, but the football sides, the rugby union sides. They were really ahead of the game. And I think, as you said, with ice hockey, I was kind of brought into that glitz and glamour. Films like The Mighty Ducks in the 90s brought me into it. And as a kid, you would look at your sports teams and you wouldn't have any of that. And that's what Keithley provided.
It's interesting, because as you say, from the doldrums of the mid to late 80s, where would Keithley have been without Cougarmania, as daft a question as that is?
Well, it's quite an interesting what if, really, because I had two interesting chats, one during the writing of the book and one afterwards. During the writing, I spoke to the chairman that kind of left just as the O'Neill regime sort of started with Smith and Spencer, a guy called Colin Farrer. And Colin actually came back with Neil Spencer and saved the club again in, I believe it was 20, I can't remember the date, but it's twice that Colin saved the club. Now, Colin is a very successful businessman, and I've gotten absolutely no kind of reservations that if Colin had been at the helm, Keighley would have teetered along as a club in existence for a number of years. But then we bring in something like Super League, when all of this change is kind of forced on clubs, and we see the impact of what happened to some sides then. And I think Keighley probably, without that backing that was required at the time, there probably wouldn't have been a Keighley club.
We are now at this stage again where we're going to have another shake-up. We're not quite sure what the gradings or criteria will be to be a grade A, grade B, grade C club or whatever. Keithley are trying to position themselves. Well, are they trying to position themselves? Because they're not big fans of what's going on at the moment.
I think so. To put in a nutshell what's happening at the moment, I think for people involved at Keighley, and the supporters, there is a very big sense of deja vu, in the sense of when I was writing this book, a lot of the things I was writing about then started to happen in real life, in regards to Cougars doing extremely well this season and then gaining promotion. There's some vast differences between what's being proposed now and what happened last time that obviously we haven't got time to go into those. But I think that from Keithley's perspective, they are wholly and 100% correct in their assertion that merit of performance on the field of play should be one of the key, if not the only, decision-making tool in who plays in the top division in a sport. But we have to also look at the position that we're in. And I think that is where it's become difficult for Keighley, because they are on that huge trajectory. They have money, they have investors, they have sponsors that have joined them, similarly as what they have done back in 94-95. Now, those sponsors in 94-95 disappeared. As soon as the door was shut, they were gone. And I think the worry is that could potentially happen this time. That is why there's been such a pushback. So there's the two points there. One, they don't believe that it's right in the ethos of the sport. And two, it could be extremely damaging for the club. But personally, you know, I'm not going to give all my views on what's happening here. There's not enough time. But I can completely 100% understand their frustration. And I do have a worry that we're going to be in a position where big decisions are going to have to be made in a short space of time again. And potentially we could really impact those kind of smaller clubs.
Keithley as a town, you know it far better than I do, because I think I've only been there a couple of times. How does it compare with the likes of, say, a St Helens or a Castleford or a Widnes, just picking three places out at random, Warrington or what, at Rochdale?
Yeah.
Is it that much smaller than any of these other places, some of which are in Super League, some of which are not?
Well, that was another interesting thing in my research, is I did have a look at a number of the census graphs. And Keighley, without a doubt, is in the lower third of the population of rugby league towns, as it was back in sort of 95 when they made the decision. And, you know, Maurice Lindsay said to me, Keithley was a small town. They were too small. And if you do look at population, if you take somebody like at the time, if you take a London at whatever million, and you take a Nottingham at whatever million, a Blackpool at whatever million, and you compare them, you know, in that kind of comparison of millions to thousands, Keighley and Castleford are roughly the same size. Wigan's not significantly bigger than Keighley, but the big thing that is kind of overlooked when looking at this is we look at the population of a town. Now, if you look at Keighley on a map and where it's positioned, it's more North Yorkshire, heading up towards Cumbria. And a lot of the support at the, you know, in the 90s came from that area. So really, I think when we look at sizes of places, we do, you know, it is important. But no, I wouldn't say it's significantly smaller than, you know, one of those towns.
As you mentioned, Maurice Lindsay, and I've got to find it in the book now. He does mention that you spoke to him about Keighley, and he said it's a small town. It's not big enough to not directly quote him, but obviously there were plenty of small towns involved in Super League or close to Super League at the time. So what was it like speaking to him? Because obviously you're one of the last people to interview him. And obviously he's a massively divisive figure. That's not a understatement. What was he like to speak to?
So I think, first of all, it was a real privilege to speak to Maurice, because I've always wanted to ask him those questions. It was a very cathartic exercise, and he didn't have to talk to me. He knew what I was writing about. He knew the questions would be difficult, and obviously he was not in the best of health. So I really did appreciate the fact that he spoke to me. But that is something as a wider rugby league community that people do. We're a very, you know, if you ignore Twitter, we're a very nice, loving community. But then again, I didn't really agree with a lot of the things Maurice said, and they were pretty much a carbon copy of what he said between 95 and 2001 or whatever it was. I think specifically, like when we're talking about a club being too small, yes, Keithley's smaller than Wigan. It is smaller than St Helens. It's smaller than Huddersfield. You know, it's a small place. But then if you look at the kind of attendances and the potential at the time, I mean, really, if we start to kind of hamstring and pigeonhole and kind of take clubs and put them like that, what I was sort of trying to explain during our conversation is that we're kind of creating, our own kind of, basically, we're telling the clubs what their destiny are and not allowing them to achieve what they could achieve. But the thing that I did kind of get into a slight bit of confusion with Maurice was that he kept referring to the criteria for Super League. Now, as far as I could find in all my research, there wasn't any written criteria for that first Super League. It was just what had been kind of thought of in Maurice's head and communicated by Maurice and Sir Rodney. But the interview with Maurice was really good. It was great, but he was, well, it probably would have been easier for me to get into Buckingham Palace. He was that guarded, is all I would say. But he did agree to speak to me again, and there were plans that I would call him up and speak to him when the book was finished. But obviously, he did pass away, so that didn't happen.
I do like the fact that straight away after you do your introduction, he's straight on the front foot. He's not holding back. He's going to. Nope. He's putting his agenda on the table. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm saying. You're not going to dissuade me from this. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, if we'd have been in a fight, that would have been a jab straight away, definitely.
But as I have said on the podcast before, sometimes you need a leader like that, and obviously it wasn't to the benefit of Keithley, but maybe, well, someone will say to the detriment of the sport or not. It's up to people to decide on his legacy, isn't it? And that will be discussed for many, many years. It's a shame that there's not a book about him. He didn't write his book before he passed away, because it would have been fascinating to really get into his brain. Bullmania. What an interesting concept. And it does seem that this story is, I'll use a Wakefield comparison. I think we're all, as Wakefield fans, stuck in 1968, despite the fact that the week after that kick, we won the championship for the second straight season. But we can't get past that moment in time. Is there a danger that Keighley fans can't get past this moment? You've mentioned the current situation and going back to 94, 95, 96. Does there need to be some kind of catharsis that gets everyone past this and moves forward? Or can that even be done?
I mean, first of all, I don't think at the moment, I think Keithley would very happily go along with just being Keithley. But what kind of keeps happening is, and when I say keeps happening, that sounds like it happens every week. It doesn't. But what does seem to happen is there are these major decisions that are made, such as the removal of academies, etc. And this season, obviously, the potential restructuring via grading by IMG. And these things happen to Keighley when they seem to be on quite an upward trajectory. Now, that is purely coincidence. There is no conspiracy, obviously. But yes, there is a possibility that does become Keithley's, that becomes the part in their history that they can't get past, because it's something that they achieved. It's something that was real. It was something that was felt. It was tasted, and it was taken away. And I think for a number of the clubs that were kind of in the same boat at the same time, they got that back. Widnes got it back. Wakefield got it back. Salford got it back, etc., etc. But Keighley and Batley, they were two of the clubs that didn't get it back. But Keighley were the ones that carried on that legal fight for 12 months or something like that. It spent a lot of money. It ruined lives, that decision for people involved at Keighley. So it really is that last great, that is the top of the iceberg at the moment. Everything since then has gone down. There's been peaks up, but that is the last height. And really, there's not been anything since as significantly large enough to kind of erase that. And Bullmania, that's a completely different kettle of fish on top of that. I'm very much of the opinion that we can't keep thinking that the current Bradford Bulls Rugby League Football Club Limited, or whatever they're called, are any
relation to what happened 20, 25 years ago, because they're not getting 25,000 people. They're not selling out games, not doing this and that, and they're having to rebuild like many other clubs have done in the past. And it seems that, it's mentioned, you can't have two teams in the Bradford Metropolitan District. It's right, in fact, we've got two teams in Hull and Wakefield and Castleford are next door to each other and seemingly coexist. Why can't a Keighley and a Bradford coexist in the same division? There's no reason why they can't, is there? They're completely different entities.
They support each other. I mean, I used to go watch Bradford play at Oddsall. Prior to the announcement of Super League, I would say that the relationship between the majority of Bradford Northern fans and Cougars fans was quite good. Yes, there was the normal rivalry, but there wasn't this kind of bitter hatred that followed. You got people like Peter Rowe, who, he was a great player for Bradford, coached Keithley and played for them. Peter Rowe is beloved by both sets of players, people such as Joe Phillips with the trophy. There's enough room for a Keithley and a Bradford. The issue that happened with Keithley and Bradford is that there was an overriding feeling that what they had created at Keithley and the vibe they had was trying to be, this isn't my opinion. Just first of all, the majority of the feeling was that all of that had been lifted and put in Bradford for the benefit of Bradford and Super League. Now, elements of that are completely false, but there is an element that is true, in the sense of it is absolutely 100%, fair and accurate to assume that something happening, 20 minutes down the road is not going to go unnoticed, and other clubs that look at it are going to try and replicate it. And that's what Bradford did in bringing in someone like Peter Deakin, who put his own spin on it. But I think the main issue was that what Bradford had in Super League, which was fantastic, it was Cougarmania on steroids. There was a feeling that if Keithley had had the money that was thrown behind that by not only the RFL, Super League and Sky, of course, in regards to the production, etc., the way it was hyped up on Sky TV, if they'd have had that, perhaps they could have increased their audiences by a percentile amount such as Bradford did. Which is fair to say that could have happened. Whether it could have got to the level of Bradford of 20,000 whatever fans, that's up for debate. That's down to history. But I think that's where the main issue of that bone of contempt came from.
I think you've hit on something with the change of attitude in terms of it was, and I hate the word, but the kind of banter you would have between you and your rival fans in the olden days. And then when Super League came in, and it wasn't necessarily what your team did on the pitch. If your team loses, then you can blame the referee or blame, the other team cheating or whatever. But when Super League came in, you've got even more monsters to blame, such as Maurice, Lindsay, the Rugby Football League, Rupert Murdoch and whoever for your teams and clubs' failings, whether they're right or not, and that spills out onto, it used to be just the terraces, but now, as you mentioned, Twitter and social media and forums or whatever, and there is that bitter edge, which there is unfortunately the potential for that to come back in spades with whatever happens with this current grading system.
I think so. I think if you look at literally a day after the announcement, there was a number of commentators, journalists, content producers for Rugby League who immediately sat down and had some easy content to do, which was interesting watching. It's interesting watching to be like, right, what does Richard rank? How would you rank the teams? But what it did is it immediately also created a division, and we were no longer looking at what's best for Rugby League. We were looking at what's best for Leeds, what's best for Keighley, what's best for Hunslet, etc., etc. Now, that also opens up another argument of, who's better, Leeds, Keithley or Hunslet? Well, I can tell you who's better. Leeds are the best. Why? Because they finished higher up in the league structure. Oh, okay. But what we're introducing as well is that secondary element that fans don't understand on a general kind of level. And Nigel Wood told me this himself when I spoke to him, is that the things that they're grading on, that go on in the background, you may have a nice shiny house from the outside, but it may be absolute mess inside. And that's what clubs are going to be graded on. And it immediately opens up all this discussion, all of these different points of view over which is best. And obviously, the traditional way of deciding which is the best is to pick up a ball and play on a field. But that's not the way we're going again. So, of course, it's going to open up so much debate.
Without mentioning any teams at all, it does seem that there are some teams in Super League at the moment who, I'm not saying are throwing this season in, but they certainly, the way they've prepared would suggest that they're not necessarily worried about finishing bottom of the pile were that to happen. But I've got no idea what's going to happen next year. And, as I say, you read these articles and people saying, well, Leeds are top and Wigan and Hull FC are B and this. They don't know. No one has an absolute clue what's going to happen in the future.
No.
But what we're doing is what happened in the past, which is this strange thing we can try and learn from. It's an absolutely fascinating piece of work. And as Phil mentions in the magazine in the review, this is going to be one of those books that people look back on and learn from and try to replicate for their clubs and whatever. But Keithley, in such a unique place and a unique time, having to rebuild with all going on around them and still to be around today. As you say, there's been ups and downs and plenty of downs.
Yeah.
Although there's some people at the club don't like me, so that's good. But, I like Keighley better than Bradford. So, you've got that in your favour in the BD postcode area. But they could be on the way back. They could be on the way back, but it's how they get back. And do clubs have a natural level? I don't know. No one has a clue what's going to happen next. Could Keighley say, we know Warrington have got lots of investment in them. Should someone in Keighley win the Euro Millions and have £100 million, why can't Keighley be the next Warrington or whatever? There's no reason why any club outside of Super League couldn't be a Super League club or whatever they're going to rebrand it in the future just by dint of luck.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, in my opinion, when it comes to rugby league, there's always going to be this kind of conflict between an investor who's going to invest money into a club and a club that is owned and run by somebody who has invested themselves in the club. Historically, a lot of rugby clubs were run by people that were, former players. They were elected to a role. They were owned by, the history of the clubs. And if you look now, we do have a number of teams owned by very wealthy owners who are playing out of, stadiums that are, muck stadiums, you could call them, or soccer rented stadiums, etc. But some of them are doing very well. Would I, as a Keithley fan, like to see somebody with multi-millions come in and invest in Cougars? No. Simply put, because I think that Keithley have got the right owners at the moment. I think the people that have the biggest love and heart for Keithley are the O'Neills, Mike Smith, Judith Smith, and everyone else that's involved in Keithley at the moment. I think they're the ones. And you can tell, because Keithley, the success of Keithley always kind of coexists with having somebody at the helm of the club that the fans buy into. And the people of Keithley and the fans of Keithley will only buy into an owner if they can see they are giving their heart and soul to that club. And I think that's kind of where it weighs in. Now, I think Keithley naturally would have progressed towards, the top half of the championship over the next couple of seasons if the level of investment that the O'Neills were putting in, etc., was the same. Would they have got to Super League? Who knows? Would I like to see them buy entry to Super League? No, I wouldn't.
Almost going down the Batley route. I know we're running out of time, so Batley are the best comparison of how to run things outside of Super League, I guess. Certainly in the last few seasons.
Yeah, fantastic club.
Comedy, I am told, is tragedy plus time. Is there any comedy in the demise of Cougarmania?
Plenty. The amount of, basically, if you start reading the book, Joe Grimmer said to me that when I spoke to Joe Grimmer, he said, "I want your book to make me laugh, but I also want it to give me a tear in my eye. And if it does both, then I'll shake your hand. You've done a good job." And I'd like to think it does that. Yeah. But yeah, there's plenty of OMG moments, as they would say in the book.
Having produce this, as you say, millions of words, nothing like exaggeration. What are you going to do next? What's the next project? Or do you just like sleep now for about 20 years and just go, no more?
Well, I did have a break to say hi to my fiance and meet the rest of my family again, and maybe see the dogs. But my break's break's at an end now. So I've started working on a book with Phil Larder. So that book is going to be written with the coaching team from the 2003 World Cup. So we're working on that currently, and really their kind of side of the story, perspective of what happened and how they got there has never come out. So not one particularly for all the rugby league listeners, but that's what I'll be doing next. And then the book after that might look a little bit similar to the one you're holding. That's a little hint. Possibly might continue the story of Keighley.
Cougarmania 2. This time it's personal.
Yeah, just due to the fact of material that I've been handed on a plate by IMG over the past couple of months.
I mean, I do like how you stopped the league tables just before Wakefield actually got good. So thanks for that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, that was just for you,
Johnny. It is some piece of work. Thank you for writing it, because these stories need to be told. Thanks for joining us. Have a successful book. Fingers crossed people will pick it up either pre or post Christmas now. Have a great Christmas, Happy New Year, and we might get you on to talk about Phil Larder's book. Who knows? I mean, we probably won't, but we'll put the invite out there anyway.
To bring me on to talk about the next when Cougars get given a category A or F or whatever they get. That'll do. We can come shoot the proverbial on that. Yeah, that'll be a fun day. Can't wait for Twitter that day.